Hey guys. That's why I start all my videos. Hey guys. So turns out, I'm gonna do it this way. We're gonna do it this way. We're gonna talk about the settlement of the West this way, which is gonna be a huge time saver. So you'll know all about the settlement of the West. So in I mentioned this like several times. Like in the past, we've run this as a project just because it lends itself really well to like creating like a presentation on a different specific group. So um, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of these things, not too much detail, because quite frankly, they're not going to ask you about it in too much detail. But it's important to know the different kinds of groups that settle the West and ultimately why they go there and what happens when they get there. Okay, so let's talk about these essential questions here. Um, so what national issues emerge in the process of closing the frontier? Far West, right? Why does the West hold such an important place in the American imagination? And in what ways is the West romanticized in American culture? So the 2 and 3 really kind of refer specifically to Frederick Jackson Turner and his frontier thesis that he delivers at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. We've talked about that in class. So you should kind of think about the stuff that is being presented to you within that frame, within that lens, right? So like what national issues emerge. We looked at that interactive map together to give you a sense as to what kinds of issues are facing the United States, building these railroads, extracting resources from this land. What kind of environmental impact is that going to have? What is that going to lead to in terms of federal policy eventually? And so those are like more specific on that. Specifical. It's not a word. It's not a word, you guys. It's a word right now. I'm making it a word. So, and then 2 and 3 really like, why does the West hold such an okay, I'm gonna answer this right now. I didn't know it did. It's news to me. No, it's not news to me. I'm just kidding. Because the West represents freedom and opportunity. There's this sense of escapism. There's this sense that the frontier, which is constantly shifting, right? And now finally, what we think of the far West is finally being conquered. There's always a sense of adventure. As think Turner mentions this sense of buoyancy. He uses all these like really positive, kind of like fairly aggressive words to talk about how the West um, embodies the most kind of American features, like the American identity. So I think it has an important place in the American imagination because it's exciting, or it's been painted that way, right? It's been framed in such a way to suggest that it's full of adventure, it's full of new ideas. You can escape who you are, you can recreate yourself, and this has been true kind of always and forever in terms of the United States. Like if you, for example, if you ruined yourself like financially in the East, like I'm thinking specifically of John Adams' son-in-law makes some really series of bad investment decisions. And so to reinvent himself, he goes out west to make a new name for himself. Siri. The worst investment decisions of all time. It's interesting. We're not here to discuss that, Siri. Thanks for chiming in, though. Okay. And I think that 2 goes along kind of with 3. The West, like, has this idea that we have the opportunity, Americans have the opportunity to be the best versions of themselves. Although if you look at what actually happens in the settlement of the West focused a lot on individualism, I think there's also this lack of understanding that the federal government largely subsidizes and incentivizes the process of settlement out west. And once I say subsidizes it, I mean it pays for it, right? And then when I say incentivizes it, I mean it encourages people to move out there, despite the fact that the techniques and the strategies that they use farming in, say, Europe or Virginia don't work at all out west. And there's that story of the Russian family from the How the West Was Really Won reading, where the husband's like, I'm shocked that we made it as at all because of all the kind of trials and tribulations that we faced. So let's talk about railroad builders. Okay, so it starts with railroads because that's what gets people out there. And this is this image here. So if you're going to create questions about about this topic, you're going to see images of like the stages of railroad development, right? You start to see railroads being built and constructed in the early 19th century in the United States, most prominently, obviously, in the Northeast, and then kind of farther slightly west to places like, Ohio and Michigan. But that's where you're in Pennsylvania, like Western Pennsylvania. But this tradition is going to continue. Probably one of the most seminal moments is in 1869 is the joining of two different railroad lines to form the Transcontinental Railroad. This is finally realizing a lifelong dream of many different Americans of joining these two coasts together, so you have access to trade in the East and obviously then access to those foreign markets in the West. Who builds it? These rich guys. Look at all these Look at all these mans. It's this is the kind of amazing hard-hitting analysis you're getting at 4:41 PM. That's when I'm recording this. Okay. Sorry, just take a look around. My house. So Stanford is probably like the most well-known one. Like that's Stanford of like Stanford University, right? These guys are hella rich and they also get enormous subsidies and kickbacks from the government. So railroads have enormous potential for wealth, but they also have enormous potential for greed and corruption. So when we talked about corruption kind of tainting the Grant administration, a lot of that corruption comes from these railroad men. Why does this happen? Why? Why are you doing this? Don't do that. Okay, I'm back in. Odd. Okay. They build the railroad. It's amazing. 1869. They join those two together. It's very exciting. All right, cowboys, buckle up. Uh, in fact, though, it's kind of a grim life, and they talk about how they're striking out on their own a lot. This is the coming when you talk about romanticizing the West. There's this whole theme genre of art in the 19th century in America that mythologizes and romanticizes the lives of cowboys. Are striking out on their own. They answer to no one, right? They're like lone men, and like that's kind of true. Like sometimes, like not all the time, and in many cases, they're actually like employees, and they get paid very poorly. But one thing that is interesting about cowboys here is that you actually are going to see some diversity in terms of white cowboys and black cowboys and Hispanic cowboys. So if you're looking at Turner's thesis to say like, oh, to what extent is this true? Um, they're not like individuals necessarily, but it does kind of lead to this diverse experience across the board of working for a conglomerate, which is really not romantic at all, but what many of these cowboys did. Right. So the West is also associated with lawlessness and violence. People like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, right? This is like if you were watching the movie Tombstone. It's like where westerns come from. It's like all these guys trying to like tamp down on this all this vicious violence. It's lawless, yes, and it is violent, but it's also a lawless, violent period generally. I mean, the same time that this kind of stuff is going on, there's like rampant violence and terror post Reconstruction in the South. It's just that, first of all, can we just discuss that Bat Masterson is like a dynamite name? He is the best name, hands down. Bat, what's that short for? I don't even know. So is it violent? Yes, like to suggest otherwise would be like a lie. But it's not necessarily like shockingly or disproportionately violent for the period. It's just that by that point in time, you're not having sort of like the legal system that is still kind of being pieced together in the East sent out to the West. All right. So one of the things we talk about is so by the way, backtrack about cowboys. Cowboys are obviously corralling cattle. Just to let you know, they are moving the cattle. It's like this really arduous journey, but that's kind of like the support for movement of resources. And miners obviously are also, you're going to like when we talk about labor union disputes and workers trying to demand wages, miners are often at the center of this. Mining is enormously dangerous, enormously arduous labor. People are not paid particularly well, and they also work for these massive companies that don't pay their laborers meaningful wages. And so some of the worst labor union or like, and we don't have to talk about labor unions, but some of the worst corporation and like employer versus employee violence are actually at these mining centers. Like the Ludlow massacre in the early 20th century is probably one of the most notable examples. Pinkertons are sent in and they mow down men, women, and children trapped in these tents, even though they're surrendering. But mining is really dangerous work, but it's enormously significant because they're extracting all these really valuable resources, stripping the land of iron and coal and silver and gold, which are going to then play an enormous role in the second industrial revolution going on post Civil War. Making great industries in the figures of like Carnegie and the railroad men. People like Rockefeller, right? JP Morgan, all of these guys have all their like kind of fingers in the pots. But in particular, obviously, Andrew Carnegie is a steel guy. And so you need to have control over all of these things. You need to have laborers working there. And you need to also obviously ultimately remove indigenous people from this land. And we'll talk more about South Dakota and its impact in terms of the showdown between the federal government and a certain Lakota band there. But that'll be next week. Okay, cool. Nice. Okay, so these towns would like pop up and then they would like disappear because what would happen, people would go in, they would extract what they could and then leave. So once the land was exhausted, there was no point in being there anymore. And so people just left. And so you can actually go to these places still, and they're like these empty, creepy, horror movie-esque ghost towns, but that got all built up during these mining booms and then were subsequently abandoned after the land had been stripped. That says the cattlemen and sheep herders. You can't make that out. Cattle trails. This is what the cowboys are moving, right? They're moving cowboys, right? Up and down to get them from one urban area to another to then ship them, sometimes initially alive on trains, which is really messy and a lot of them die. But they're moving them from one spot to another to then move them east to feed this burgeoning population of Americans. So yeah, this is fun. Land use, beef cattle, dairying. Yeah, Wisconsin, cheese. Wine. Oh, that's going to be California. Fruit. Sorry, I'm into this. Just give me a moment with this map. This is cool. I'm into this. I feel like if I was going to make a question, I'd be like, what can you infer about the use of the land? Obviously, if you look in the South, there's still sharecropping, right? You're still seeing a lot of these cash crops in the South continue to be harvested and sharecropping. But the Midwest is known for beef. That's why it's called the Omaha Steaks. But again, this is not good for the land. It's like bad for the land. It's like very bad for the land. You can tell that with the kind of the stuff like grazing land, whatever. And that's why they come up with like barbed wire and stuff like that to keep animals from like escaping. Okay. So if you want to try to get as much out of the land as possible, you're trying to make as much stuff as possible. You're trying to make that process more efficient. And so the late 19th century is all about speeding up these processes. And this is a period that's known for the mechanization of agriculture. So you see that obviously in the early 19th century with textile industries, and then you're going to see that shift to post-Civil War with these kinds of developments that are going to revolutionize production, but also that's going to lead to problems for farmers who are going to have all this overproduction. They're going to overproduce all of these grains, right? So like the Midwest is known as the breadbasket of America, along with beef. And the reason it's called the breadbasket of America is because of these kind of mechanized tools. Barbed wire is developed to keep animals from straying, but they're also going to then and getting attacked by other things, but it's going to lead to the decrease in the buffalo population. And it's a fundamentally different way that Americans use the land versus indigenous people. And so barbed wire is a really useful tool to protect your investment, but it also winds up completely upending thousands of years of the way people live their lives. And there are fights between the sheep herders and the cattle ranchers. It's fine. Minority groups in the West. Oh, Turner did not talk about these people. All right. So let's talk about, well, obviously the North is going to whites of native parentage. South, well, that makes sense. So the West, what does that tell you? Well, that's going to tell you not many. And then you see kind of this breakdown. A lot of people in the far West, especially in California, China is going through a series of political and economic upheavals in the late 19th century, which is why most people like try to leave anyway. Like most people who are coming to America are not like living their best life wherever they are. No one's like, you know what, I'm gonna up and leave. Just leave everything behind, my family, my life, my my job that pays me reliably. They're gonna go because they're facing economic deprivation or political persecution or religious persecution. So Chinese immigrants arrive in the United States in large numbers, in large part due to famine and political upheaval. Black Americans, before they begin to move north to cities like New York and Boston and Baltimore. That's called the Great Migration. That doesn't really happen until post World War One, like post 1914. But Black Southerners do seek to escape, right, the kind of terror that they experience after Reconstruction ends, and they move to places like Kansas and Missouri. So you're going to see larger Black populations here trying to eke out survival without fear of constant reprisals by whites. Oh, moving west, 1890. This is fun. Dakotas. Mm, Dakota Territory. That's different. I'm trying to look at the blue. Sometimes I don't even understand these things. I'm like, what is happening? Okay. It's like all the places they go. All right, I got it. I got it now. I mean, again, why are people like there's such a thing as like internal migration. So there's migrants, right? So you just want to understand like when Turner's talk, and I don't think this necessarily doesn't fit Turner's thesis. It's just that he does not, when he's writing his thesis, he's not thinking about these particular groups. Buffalo soldiers are, these are Union soldiers. These are former Black Union soldiers who, after they are removed from the land, like federal occupation, excuse me, of the South, they're shifted to dealing with Indian wars. So they go west to deal with the rising. Well, it's not necessarily an Indian threat, but like it is, right? Because the Indians live there and they're in the way of extracting useful things from the land. This is a romantic view. It's hard living out in the West. It's difficult living in the past, just generally. Okay, so we're going to spend more time talking about the Indian Wars next week. But you do want to know that between like 1870 and 1890, like hundreds of wars are fought. There's no one. The big one that everyone kind of knows about is the Battle of Little Bighorn, because it's like the one notable example where indigenous people defeat whites. But we're going to talk more about this next week. All right. So one of the things that winds up becoming very apparent in the late 19th century is anti-Chinese rhetoric and sentiment. It's the first and only group that is excluded in terms of immigration law historically. Like there's quota systems put in place, which means limits on certain groups and where they can come from. But no, like you could not, unless you like knew somebody, which people escaping, famine typically don't, right, in China. But they're seen as a threat to white labor. They are portrayed horrifically in the press. It's racism abounds. They're associated with crime, with drug use, opium, which is what the British, honestly, that's their responsibility. But you have you don't really see this kind of strenuous anti whatever group law at all. You really, really don't. This is the one only group that this takes place, and this is not. What is happening upstairs in my house? You don't see limits placed on any other groups until the 1920s, and not even to this level at all. These are, so once Chinese immigrants arrive in the United States, they form their own, like they're kind of forced to live only with each other, which is true if you look at like major urban centers anyway of any kind of immigrant group. And so these groups form, and then there's like these rival gang wars between these different groups of Chinese immigrants, and they begin in the late 19th century and kind of come to an end in the early 20th century, in large part due to um, external forces beyond their control. Like I just read about this, so I wanted to brush up on it. Um, it has to do with a lot of their places of business wind up getting shut down by law enforcement, and so they're no longer able to fight these wars because their places of businesses have been closed. Okay. So this is to suggest that the West is not completely obviously dominated by and controlled by and settled by white Americans. It's a fairly diverse operation. There's more diversity than one would think when you think about the history of the West, not that you necessarily do. Um, but this does not kind of fit in Frederick Jackson Turner's view. Farmers. Okay. So farmers, so you see people go out, and this is kind of interesting, right? All of these different areas. This stuff just means that it has not been settled in a meaningful way. The frontier does not close, right? So this is why it says 1890, like all of this stuff kind of gets settled. But farmers go out in large part because they're incentivized by the federal government, the Homestead Act. And as I think you read about in the readings, 160 acres, and then you watched it in that Ed puzzle, but it's not nearly enough land. You need like thousands of acres, or hundreds, at least hundreds of acres, to do what they were asked to do. And so they are, it's lonely, it's arduous, and it's very, very difficult. And it's romanticized, like, oh, everyone's going to go out as families, they're going to live together, and the parents are looking out for the children. And like, I'm sure some of them were, but also some of them were like, oh, don't fall into that vat of whatever. Please don't die, because I need you as like labor. All right, what's the message of this picture? Oh my God, it's so beautiful. Look at the little girl looking at the other girl picking flowers. What is she clutching in her hand? It's a knife. What is she? And by the way, this is there's a really good scary movie, I think it came out a few years ago, about a woman experiencing all of these like hallucinations out west. And you're like, is she hallucinating, or is she being attacked by like a virago? But the whole idea is that you're completely isolated. It's super rural. There's no one is near you for miles and miles and miles. It is bleak. It is grim, because oftentimes their husbands have to leave and like go to deliver whatever they're making to railroads. So women are often left attending to these large families all by themselves. And so she's armed because she's ready to murder someone. Like she does not have a happy look on her face. These two kids seem oblivious. She's aware. Oh God. Look at her two horses. I remember this reading that I used to give students, and it was about you could hear the termites in the wallpaper, and women would be driven insane by listening to scratching noises of the bugs in the wallpaper. Ah, it's our boy. He delivers this in Chicago in 1893, and he's like, the West is the best. It's the best of America. This is where the romanticizing comes from. It's from this guy. And he's not like all wrong. Like, I'm not trying to say he's all wrong, because he's not. He's just not painting the full portrait. But like, no one's painting the full portrait in the late 19th century. He's not alone in this. This is the same time in which like Reconstruction, like historians in the early 20th century are like, Reconstruction is totally corrupt and it's the worst thing ever. And like, sure, there's corruption, but it's not like, no one's giving you the full picture. Again, like that wouldn't like really happen anyway. Okay, so what winds up happening is everyone's like, oh my gosh, we're like really, I don't care. I don't care about this. I want to go back to the conservation stuff. Okay, I'm going to talk about this when we talk about Indians. I'm coming back. I'm coming back. Okay, let's talk about this. Yeah, there we go. Okay, again, we'll talk about this when we talk about Indians. Um, don't worry too much about it. We spend like we're going to spend 2 class blocks talking about the Indian Wars. So we'll come back to that, and we can kind of discuss the romanticizing with the Buffalo Bill show and all of that, like the Wild Wild West show, and how that's kind of using Indian culture as entertainment. But we'll come back to that when we talk about the Indian Wars and experiences of Indigenous people. But let's talk about conservation. So when we think about the environment, we think about the environmental movement. That's kind of like a 1960s burgeoning movement, but there are efforts in the United States to say, we might be doing irrevocable damage to the land, and we should probably maintain these pristine vistas and protect them. And probably the one who's most notably responsible for this is actually Theodore Roosevelt. And he's president in the early 20th century. He establishes a series of national parks. Um, so John Muir is the one who's most famous. Like he's a famous American policymaker who leads the conservation movement. You're conserving these resources. You're making sure that generations of people can have access to this land, and it's not being used for like drilling, for minerals, whatever. It's just like the pristine beauty of nature. Like part of the reason the West is so amazing and so gorgeous is because it's been untouched. So there's this movement to sort of ensure that it's untouched. Sierra Club groups who are committed to maintaining the environment. And then that's what we'll talk about next week. So again, when you look at the settlement of the West, honestly, I think the best thing that we'll do, and we'll kind of review again, is the reading, the Miriam Horn reading, and we're going to look at. You really want to understand what is Frederick Jackson Turner's message, and to what extent is it accurate? Like, what could you choose one particular group that says like this is not necessarily super true, right? There's elements of truth, but there's also elements he's missing, and you want to kind of think about that. So that's it. That's what I got, and hopefully you watch this. Hopefully I'll see 42 views. I won't. It's okay. I don't take it personally. It's all right. All right. I'm going to go finish grading TBQs, you guys. Super, super great hanging with you. Peace.